Okay, so in this video, we're going to look at the objectives with regard to this unit on ecology. And before we go any further, ecology itself it's really how all the living things that live in a particular ecosystem, how they interact. We're going to talk about feeding, we're going to talk about competition, we're going to talk about how the organisms relate to each other, how energy flows through the environment, and how it gets things get recycled. We kind of talked a little bit about recycling stuff when we talked about the roles of fungi and bacteria in being decomposers, but we're going to go into just a little bit more detail. So let's get started. The first thing we've got here is interpret. Now, that does not mean translate from one language to another. What are we interpreting? Relationships including, which means that means if you see the term including, it means we've got to do it. Including predation, parasitism, commensalism, mutualism, and competition among organisms. So, when we talk about interpret stuff, we're going to be provided with some information. Okay? Provided with info. And what you have to decide is which relationship it is. So is this an example of mutualism? Is this an example of commensalism? Which relationship? And it's pretty straightforward, and most of the time it's pretty common sense. For example, if you had a picture of a rabbit and a fox and the grass, and you were asked what is the relationship between the rabbit and the fox, you know that a fox basically wants to do one thing to a rabbit, eat it. In which case, the fox would be the predator and the rabbit would be the prey, and the relationship would be predation. One thing that I do every single month is give my dogs a pill which prevents them from contracting heartworm, because heartworms get into a dog's heart. It's actually transferred to the dog by a vector, which is a mosquito, and the mosquito will bite the dog and inject heartworm eggs into the dog's bloodstream, which make their way to the heart. They then hatch and form worms that look a lot like spaghetti, and they clog up the dog's heart and will kill it. In that case, the heartworm is in a very good position because it gets everything it needs from the dog. It gets oxygen, it gets food from the blood, it gets a nice, safe, warm, stable environment. So it's really good for a heartworm to infect a dog. It's really bad for the dog because it will ultimately mean less food, less resources, less ability to live its life normally, and can sometimes be fatal. That would be an example of parasitism. The heartworm would be the parasite and the dog would be the host. Commensalism, the one we see about commensalism all the time is if you look out in any pasture where you see cattle, you'll see those white birds. Contrary to popular belief, those white birds are not picking ticks and bugs off the cows. But as the cattle walk through the pasture, they stir up the grass, and that stirs up bugs, and the birds catch all the bugs from the air that are around them. That's really good for the birds because they're getting help to get their food. The cattle help them get food by walking through the pasture and stirring up all the bugs, which the birds can then eat. The cattle themselves do not benefit, but they're also not harmed by the birds eating the bugs around them. So that's good for the birds, and it's kind of neutral. It doesn't affect the cattle at all. Mutualism, we'll get onto, that's where it's beneficial for both things. We've talked about mutualistic beneficial bacteria. There's bacteria that live in our gut that help with our digestion. They help us break down food. They help us recycle important nutrients. Some bacteria in our gut actually make types of vitamins that we need. That's very good for us. The bacteria themselves, they get plenty of good food. They get plenty of warmth, of moisture, of oxygen, of everything that they need. So it's good for us and it's good for the bacteria. That would be mutualism. Competition is a big deal. Competition comes up again and again. Competition between two living things. So those bunnies we were talking about, the foxes want to eat the bunnies. Hawks that fly around want to catch the bunnies. So the hawks and the foxes are in competition with each other for the bunny. Okay, so that's all different types of relationships. So we've got to provide, we'll have information, pictures, diagrams, graphs, whatever, and we got to decide which relationship is it. And the relationships we're going to have to pick from are these ones here. Okay, all right, flow of energy. So we're going to have to analyze, okay, flow of matter and energy through tropic levels using various models, including food chains, food webs, and ecological pyramids. So what that's saying is this, and you know this because there's nothing more complicated than probably something you did when you were in 7th grade. So here is some grass. We know grass is a producer, okay? We know that grass takes energy from the sun and converts it into glucose and carbohydrates that help it grow. Here is a bunny. What does that bunny do to the grass? Right? That little bunny is going to eat the grass. What that means is that energy from the grass is going to be transferred to the rabbit. Okay, so along comes something that wants to eat the rabbit. Let's say it's, I don't know, it's a hawk that has big strong beak and it has big wings, and it sees that rabbit and it is going to, it's got its eyes, it needs its eyes, it's going to see that rabbit and it's going to want to fly down and eat it. So we've got the producer, we've got the primary consumer, which is the bunny, and we have the secondary consumer, which is the hawk. And energy from the rabbit is going to get transferred to the hawk. What we have here is a food chain. And food chains show you the flow of energy in an ecosystem. So, and you notice that the arrows do not tell you what eats what. The arrow, right, in any food chain represents the flow of energy. Now, that's a food chain, which we've got here. A food web would be, okay, is there anything else that eats grass? Is there anything else that eats grass? Yes, maybe it's a mouse. Okay, so some of the energy from the grass goes to the mouse. Okay, so now what we have is a multiple food chains. And you know what? That hawk is definitely going to try and eat a mouse if it sees it. So energy from the mouse. So now what we've got are multiple food chains, and we call that multiple food chains. We call that a food web. Okay? Ecological pyramids are nothing more complicated than if I count up the entire mass of all the grass, right? So this is the grass. And then I count up the mass of all the bunnies, right? That's the rabbits. And then I count up all the energy or mass that's stored in the hawks, and that is the hawk. Okay, and this is something called biomass. It's basically, if I could take and weigh in kilograms all the mass in a pasture, all the bunnies in a pasture, and all the hawks in a pasture, this is what it would look like. And this is called an ecological pyramid. Okay, and they're always this shape. Okay, an ecological pyramid. Okay, which is the other thing here that we have to do. We have to talk about ecological pyramids. I want to put something in here because you'll notice this does not look much like a pyramid. It doesn't really look like, a perfect pyramid shape. And there's a reason for that. Because if you think about how much energy is being absorbed from the sun by that grass, only a small amount of it is actually going to end up being passed on to the rabbits. In fact, of all the energy that's in the grass, only 10% ends up being passed on to the rabbit. So for every 100 kilograms of grass, right, only 1 kilogram would actually get processed into making, the rabbit grow bigger, maybe rabbit, muscles. And when you look at all the rabbits and you look at how much energy that's stored in the rabbit bodies that gets passed on to the hawk, only 10% gets passed on to the hawk. It's called the rule of 10%. So each arrow actually only represents 10% of the available energy. Where does all the other 90% go? It goes back into the ecosystem, right? Ultimately, it's going to end up as heat, right? And we'll talk about that in a little more detail. The last objective we've got is another good verb, describe. So what are we going to have to describe? Well, we are going to have to describe the flow of matter through the carbon and nitrogen cycles, right? So carbon and nitrogen cycle, basically, there's CO2 in the air. We know plants take it in through photosynthesis. We know everything else, including plants, turn CO2 back into the air because of respiration. Think about it. When we breathe in oxygen. When we breathe out carbon dioxide. Okay? Photosynthesis removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, from the air. Respiration puts it back in there. That's the carbon cycle. The nitrogen cycle, a little more complex, but basically it's the same principle. There's N2 nitrogen in the air. Plants and animals take it out. And when we die, we put it back in. Okay? So that's what we're going to look at. What happens when we disrupt it? What we're talking about there is things like global warming and runoff of nutrients from farmlands, things like that. So that's kind of a very brief introduction. A lot of this stuff we've covered before. It should be pretty straightforward.